Welcome back to another episode of Offbeat Adventures. We're standing here once again on the grade of the former Canadian Northern Railway and later Canadian National Railway's Kinghorn Subdivision. We are kind of in the middle of nowhere. We are on the northeast corner of Partridge Lake, which is just through the trees there. We are about 9 miles east of the community of Jellicoe, Ontario, here in the municipality of Greenstone. So what we're doing is we're picking up where we left off on a previous hike here, which we did a bunch of years ago. Hopefully we're going to redo this one as well. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working our way from this point right here 5 miles to the east, or sorry, to the west, to Kinghorn Road. This is a redo. So we were here 2 years ago. So we were here in the summer, so July of 2021, so it's October of 2023 right now. Right off the hop, our hike gets started, and so right here we actually have kind of a neat find, very rare. So we actually have a standing telegraph pole. You don't see very many of them. You can see there's a few insulators up on there, mostly the clear Dominion 42 ones. I'm not sure why this one wasn't chopped down. Again, there's maybe 15 of these still standing on the line. It looks like somebody made an attempt here. There are some marks here right beside the date nail. So I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but that's the date nail. So that's they use those usually for ties. But basically that indicates the year that it was put in. So it says 57, so that's 1957. So again, kind of a neat little find here. So let's get rolling here. We actually had to start over again. The camera was telling me that the battery had 70% capacity, and we started recording, got all the way to the start of Kinghorn siding, and the battery had turned off because it's dead. So we basically have to start all over again. All right, so let's get going. We do have the trailer with us today. It is a longer hike. So again, 5 miles. So we are going to throw Luna in there at some point, just to try to save her paws a little bit. So right off the hop here, we've got a few things. So again, there's Partridge Lake, which is just through the trees there. And so this area here, I'm guessing, was part of the lake that was cut off by the railway grade. So there is a culvert just up there that passes through. Here you can see actually a piece of the old segmented concrete culvert that's right there. And then here somewhere was supposed to be a milepost marker, so milepost 40. Now it's really weird. I looked everywhere, could not find it. It's basically kind of the oddball here because there's a bunch in a row that are here. So whether the sign is there or whether it's just the post is there, and then there's a bunch after this, but this one is missing. Like I said, I looked everywhere, could not find it. So milepost 40 is the mileage on the Kinghorn. So the original line, the Canadian Northern Long Lake Subdivision, actually had different mileage because the Kinghorn started in Long Lac, which we're going to talk about. The original line, the Canadian Northern line, started in Hornpain, which is 100.8 miles to the east. So any mileage on the Kinghorn, this part of the Kinghorn, you have to add 100.8 miles to. So milepost 40 becomes milepost 140.8. So here is the marker for the culvert here. Can't see it from over here, but it is legible. It does say 40.02. There you can see part of Partridge Lake. You can see it is very dry. So we've had a very kind of dry fall. And so the water is down here and there. All right, let's get biking here. So as I mentioned, this is a redo. We're redoing this because there is some new information that we want to pass along. And as well, I've been trying to redo the sections and do them in the spring or the fall, because basically you can see a lot more with some of the leaves down. Today is a rather interesting day. It's chilly. The sun is out. There's broken cloud, which is good because it gives us some it gives us some brightness without without all the shadows and the contrast. I just wanted to show this to you. I don't know if you can see this on here, but that was the temperature Monday and Tuesday. So it was very, very hot here, like unusually hot. So it's 30 degrees here, shattered all kinds of records for the beginning of October. Now, unfortunately, a cold front has come through and it has cooled off considerably. Right now, my phone, I was just looking before and it was showing 4. There is a very, very cool, cold north wind. So I'm completely dressed up. I have my gloves, I have my skull cap, I've got 2 layers on. Last week we were out and it was so warm, I was like melting. And not the case this week. So anytime we're in these kind of open areas here where the wind can kind of blow a little bit, it is cool and kind of cold on my face here. But once we get into areas where we're kind of covered up by the trees, it's not as bad. I actually kind of feel a little bit warm. Okay, so let's start with our usual history lesson here. So this line again was constructed by Canadian Northern Railway between 1911 and 1914. It was going to be one of the final pieces in Canadian Northern's transcontinental ambitions. The Canadian Northern Company got its start in Manitoba in 1896, buying up some old rail lines and some charters and things like that. Their first big project was the construction of a line between the then city of Port Arthur, which is now Thunder Bay, and Winnipeg. And that project was complete by 1902. So then Canadian Northern decided that they were going to continue to expand, started building lines all throughout the prairies. Canadian Northern actually became very synonymous with the northern part of the prairies. And then at the same time, they began expanding in the southern part of Ontario. They began the same thing, acquiring some charters and building some lines and things like that. So basically heading north from Toronto, eventually reaching up into the Sudbury area. Now, about this time, Canadian Northern realized that in order for their company to be successful long term, they would need a transcontinental connection. Now, the problem with that was that Canadian Northern did not want to build portions of that transcontinental line. So they obviously did not want to build through the mountains of British Columbia because it's very expensive, and they did not want to build this section. The reason for this section was it was long, 550 miles from the end of Steele at Ruel outside of Sudbury to Port Arthur, and it was going to be very difficult, as you're going to see by some of the terrain on this line, and therefore it's going to be very expensive. And there wasn't a lot going on in this area, so they were kind of rather hesitant to build. So they looked at all kinds of different options. They looked at running rights agreements with Canadian Pacific, and nothing panned out for them. So they were basically forced to build. So again, construction began in the latter part of 1911, really got underway in 1912, and was completed in 1914. So on New Year's Day 1914, the last spike was driven. Now, it took another year for the line to open to traffic. So it opened in actually October of 1915. Unfortunately, around that time, clouds were starting to gather for Canadian Northern. They were starting to run into financial difficulties. There was a lot of pressure from the war. Canadian Northern had, been sort of built their railway network on a lot of bonds and things like that, and those markets were tanking or had tanked. And then construction costs, right? So building this section, building through the mountains of British Columbia was extremely expensive, and so the company was not good financially. And unfortunately, it didn't get better, and so 2 years later, in 1917, the company had to be taken over by the Canadian government. And a year after that, so right at the end of 1918, Canadian Northern was merged, amalgamated, whatever descriptor that you want to use, with a bunch of other Canadian government-owned bankrupt lines called the Canadian Government Railways. And that merger produced Canadian National Railways. And so that took effect right at the beginning of 1919. And so the nationalization process took till 1923 to complete with the absorption of the Grand Trunk lines. Now, in the meantime, the name of this line had changed. It had originally been the Long Lake Subdivision of Canadian Northern Railway, and eventually became the Long Lac Subdivision of Canadian National. Now, unfortunately, that didn't last very long. I don't like the sun here. Gives us lots of shadows. Because in 1923, Canadian National began construction on a piece of rail line between Long Lac and Nakina, known as Nakina Cutoff, that basically joined those two rail lines together. So the old Canadian Northern Line and the National Transcontinental Line. And that cutoff basically allowed trains to transit from Toronto via Long Lac, Nakina to Winnipeg, and it was a shorter route. And so everything west of Long Lac became secondary. So that included this line here. So this line, its name changed. So in 1924, it became the Kinghorn Subdivision and continued operating as the Kinghorn Subdivision until 1960, when the Kinghorn, which this station, which is coming up right here, is named after, was merged with the more westerly Dorian subdivision. And that merger produced the one Kinghorn line from Long Lac to Port Arthur. So the Kinghorn continued to operate until 2005, when service was discontinued, and then starting in 2008 they began pulling up the rails, and that process was complete by 2010. So what we have here is, this is the beginning of the siding for the station at Kinghorn, so the namesake for this line. We'll talk a little bit more about the name and maybe where it came from. You can actually still see a tie here on the siding itself. Okay, and so you can see it sort of widens out here and sort of continues on. Again, I don't like these, we just kind of hit a patch of blue here, and so we get kind of all of these shadows. Okay, it's a little nicer when it's a little bit more diffused. Okay, so we're going to hold up here for a second, and then we're going to resume our journey, and Kinghorn Station is just right up ahead.